Now let us understand the typical structure of Shakespearean comedy. Although each play is different, most of them follow a recognizable 5-step pattern. The first stage is exposition. Here, the main conflict is introduced. We meet the characters, understand relationships, and identify the central problem, usually involving love, authority, or social restriction. The second stage is rising confusion. Misunderstandings begin to grow through disguise, mistaken identity, hidden emotions, or misleading situations. The dramatic tension gradually increases. The third stage is peak chaos. At this point, confusion reaches its highest level. Relationships become complicated, identities are mixed up, and the situation appears impossible to solve. This is often the most entertaining and energetic part of the comedy. The fourth stage is recognition, sometimes called revelation. Truth is finally exposed. Characters recognize real identities, misunderstandings are cleared, and hidden emotions become visible. Finally comes resolution. Social harmony is restored through reconciliation, forgiveness, and usually marriage. Order returns after the period of disorder and confusion. So, the structure of Shakespearean comedy moves from conflict to harmony, guiding characters and society toward restoration and self-understanding. Now let us compare Shakespearean comedy and tragedy, because understanding this contrast is extremely important for literary analysis and competitive exams. First, the ending. Comedy usually ends happily, with marriage, reunion, forgiveness, and restoration of harmony. Tragedy, in contrast, ends in death, destruction, or irreversible loss. Second, the hero. In comedy, the central characters usually survive and learn from their experiences. But in tragedy, the hero often dies because of personal flaws, fate, or destructive circumstances. Third, the tone. Comedy generally maintains a lighter tone filled with humor, wit, celebration, and hope, even when serious issues appear beneath the surface. Tragedy, however, is more serious, intense, and emotionally heavy. Finally, the nature of conflict. In comedy, conflict is mostly social, misunderstandings, love problems, family opposition, or identity confusion. In tragedy, the conflict becomes deeper and more internal. Characters struggle against fate, ambition, jealousy, guilt, or psychological breakdown. However, an advanced point to remember is that Shakespeare often mixes these genres. Some comedies contain dark tragic elements, while tragedies may include moments of humor. So, the key difference is this. Tragedy moves toward downfall and destruction, while comedy moves toward reconciliation, renewal, and social harmony. Now let us examine one of the major differences between classical drama and Shakespearean comedy: unity versus flexibility. Classical drama, especially according to Aristotle, emphasized the three unities: unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. Unity of time meant that the action should occur within a single day. Unity of place meant the play should remain in one location. Unity of action meant there should be only one central plot without distractions or subplots. However, Shakespeare does not strictly follow these classical rules. His comedies are structurally flexible and expansive. He freely changes locations, extends time beyond a single day, and includes multiple interconnected plots. For example, in Twelfth Night, we have the main romantic plot involving Orsino and Viola, alongside the subplot involving Malvolio and the comic household characters. These parallel plots enrich the play by adding humor, thematic depth, and social variety. This leads to an important exam line you can directly use: Shakespearean comedy is structurally expansive, not classical. In other words, Shakespeare prefers dramatic richness and emotional complexity over strict classical discipline. Now let us discuss an advanced structural technique in Shakespearean comedy: parallelism between the main plot and the subplot. Shakespeare rarely focuses on only one storyline. Instead, he develops subplots that mirror, contrast, or even parody the main plot. These subplots are not unnecessary additions, they serve important dramatic and thematic functions. First, they provide contrast. By presenting another version of love, conflict, or misunderstanding, Shakespeare allows the audience to compare different relationships and personalities. Second, subplots create comic relief. They lighten the emotional intensity of the main action and keep the dramatic movement lively and entertaining. A very important example is Much Ado About Nothing. The main plot centers on Hero and Claudio, whose relationship is serious, emotional, and vulnerable to deception. In contrast, the subplot involving Beatrice and Benedick is witty, intellectual, and based on verbal conflict rather than romantic idealism. This contrast deepens the play's exploration of love and relationships. Now, here is a very high-scoring insight. Subplots often correct or critique the main plot. In other words, the subplot may expose the weaknesses, foolishness, or limitations present in the central storyline. So, Shakespeare uses subplot parallelism not only for entertainment, but also for thematic balance, criticism, and deeper interpretation. Now let us look at some of the most important Shakespearean comedies that every literature student and competitive exam aspirant must read. First, Twelfth Night. This play is famous for disguise, mistaken identity, gender fluidity, and emotional complexity. It is especially important for studying cross-dressing, comic confusion, and the theme of desire. Second, As You Like It. This is one of the best examples of pastoral comedy and the green world concept. The Forest of Arden becomes a place of freedom, transformation, and self-discovery. Third, A Midsummer Night's Dream. This play is essential for understanding dream versus reality, irrational love, magic, and festive comedy. It also demonstrates Shakespeare's use of meta-theatre through the play within a play structure. Next, The Merchant of Venice. This comedy is extremely important because it combines humor with serious social and ethical questions, especially concerning justice, prejudice, money, and religious tension. Finally, Much Ado About Nothing. This play is highly valued for its witty dialogue, verbal battles, subplot parallelism, and exploration of love, honor, and deception. Together, these plays represent the full range of Shakespearean comedy, from romance and festivity to psychological depth and moral complexity. Now let us understand the sources and influences behind Shakespearean comedy. This is a very important topic because Shakespeare did not create all his plots entirely from scratch. Instead, he adapted and transformed earlier literary traditions into something richer and more psychologically complex. One major influence was Plautus, the Roman playwright known for farcical comedy. From him, Shakespeare borrowed techniques such as twins, mistaken identity, fast-paced confusion, and comic chaos. A strong example is the Comedy of Errors. Another influence was Terence, who contributed more refined comic structure and sophisticated dialogue. His influence can be seen in Shakespeare's balanced plotting and character interaction. Shakespeare was also deeply influenced by the Italian Renaissance tradition. From Italian literature and drama, he adopted romantic plots, courtly love themes, disguise motifs, and complex relationship structures. Many of his comedies are set in Italian cities, reflecting this cultural influence. However, Shakespeare's greatness lies not in simple imitation, but in transformation. He took existing stories and added psychological depth, philosophical complexity, and emotional realism. An important exam insight to remember is this. Many questions ask students to discuss the classical influence on Shakespearean comedy. In such answers, always mention Roman comedy, especially Plautus and Terence, along with the influence of Italian Renaissance romance traditions. Now let us explore some lesser-known but highly important aspects of Shakespearean comedy that can make your exam answers more original and sophisticated. First, the subversion of authority. In many comedies, young lovers challenge the control of elders, fathers, or rulers. Authority figures try to regulate marriage and personal choice, but the younger generation resists these restrictions. Although final harmony is achieved, the plays temporarily question rigid authority and social control. Second, language play. Shakespeare's comedies are filled with puns, wordplay, double meanings, and verbal wit. Language itself becomes a source of humor and intelligence. Characters often manipulate words to hide emotions, mock others, or create comic misunderstanding. Third, music and songs. Songs in Shakespeare are not simply decorative entertainment. They act as emotional and thematic commentary. Music often reflects the mood of the play, reveals hidden truths, or deepens philosophical meaning. Characters like Fester use songs to express ideas about love, time, and human nature. Fourth, legal and economic issues. Shakespearean comedy also engages with serious social concerns such as law, money, contracts, and justice. A major example is The Merchant of Venice, where the conflict between justice and mercy becomes central to the drama. Finally, ambiguous endings. Not all Shakespearean comedies end in complete happiness. Even after marriage and reconciliation, emotional discomfort or moral uncertainty may remain. This ambiguity gives the plays greater realism and depth. So, these lesser-known aspects show that Shakespearean comedy is far more complex than simple entertainment or laughter. Now let us look at how major critics interpret Shakespearean comedy. Using critics in your answers can greatly improve analytical quality and exam scores. First, Samuel Johnson. Johnson believed that Shakespeare's comedies reflect real life and real human behavior. According to him, Shakespeare's characters feel natural because they represent universal human emotions, weaknesses, and social interactions rather than artificial ideals. Next, Harold Bloom focuses on character psychology. Bloom argues that Shakespeare's greatness lies in his deep understanding of the human mind. In the comedies, characters are not flat comic figures, they possess emotional complexity, self-awareness, and psychological growth. So, while Johnson emphasizes realism and human nature, Bloom highlights inner consciousness and psychological transformation. Together, these interpretations help us see Shakespearean comedy as both socially realistic and psychologically profound. Now let us move into two highly advanced concepts that can make your answers sound exceptionally sophisticated in competitive exams. The first idea is the comedy of forgiveness. This is a rare but powerful way of understanding Shakespearean comedy. Shakespeare's comedies are not merely about laughter or entertainment. At a deeper level, they are about forgiveness replacing punishment. Characters who create problems, make mistakes, or behave selfishly are rarely destroyed in the way tragic villains are. Instead, they are often forgiven and reintegrated into society. The goal of comedy is reconciliation, not revenge. A very important exam line you can directly use is, Shakespeare transforms conflict into reconciliation rather than retribution. This perfectly captures the moral spirit of Shakespearean comedy. Now let us connect this with a modern theoretical idea called the benign violation theory. According to this concept, comedy works when something goes wrong, a violation occurs, but the situation is not truly threatening or dangerous. For example, mistaken identity creates confusion and disorder, but the audience knows that the situation will eventually be resolved safely. This balance between tension and harmlessness produces humor. So, Shakespeare's comedies create conflict, but they keep it within a safe emotional space where reconciliation remains possible. Using concepts like comedy of forgiveness and benign violation theory can make your interpretation appear highly modern, theoretical, and critically advanced. Now let us explore three highly advanced ideas that reveal the philosophical structure of Shakespearean comedy. First, the concept of comic time being circular. In tragedy, time usually moves in a linear direction toward downfall and destruction. The hero declines step by step until catastrophe becomes unavoidable. Comedy works differently. It begins in disorder and confusion, but by the end, society returns to harmony and balance. However, it does not simply return to the exact same condition. The final state is improved because characters have gained experience, self-awareness, and emotional maturity. That is why an important phrase to remember is restoration, not progression. Comedy restores and renews rather than destroys. Next, the principle of anti-realism. Shakespearean comedy does not strictly follow realistic logic. Instead, It freely accepts coincidence, magic, disguise, improbable situations, and sudden transformation. A major example is A Midsummer Night's Dream, where magical intervention controls love and identity. From a realistic perspective, such events seem impossible, but comedy values poetic justice and emotional truth more than strict realism. A very useful exam line is, probability is sacrificed for poetic justice. Finally, community over individual. In tragedy, the focus is usually on one central hero and that individual's downfall. But in comedy, the emphasis shifts toward group harmony and social unity. This is why marriage endings are important. Marriage is not presented merely as personal romance, it functions as a social contract that reconnects individuals to the larger community. So, Shakespearean comedy ultimately values restoration, imaginative freedom, and collective harmony over realism, isolation, and destruction. Now let us study 3 highly technical concepts that can make your answers exceptionally advanced and exam-oriented. First, the blocking figure theory. This is a very important critical concept in Shakespearean comedy. Blocking figures are characters or forces that prevent the union of lovers. These may include strict fathers, authority figures, social expectations, or rigid laws. They create obstacles that generate conflict and dramatic tension within the play. However, by the end of the comedy, these blocking figures are either removed, softened, forgiven, or transformed. Once this obstacle disappears, harmony and marriage become possible. So, the movement of comedy often depends on overcoming the blocking figure. Next, the double ending structure. Shakespearean comedy usually resolves 2 levels of conflict at the same time. The first is the personal ending, where lovers unite emotionally through marriage or reconciliation. The second is the social ending, where order, balance, and communal harmony are restored within society. This dual resolution is extremely important because Shakespearean comedy is not only about individual happiness, it is also about repairing the social structure itself. Finally, the concept of self-deception before love. Shakespeare often shows characters beginning in emotional confusion, pride, denial, or foolishness. They misunderstand themselves and others. Only after passing through error, misunderstanding, and humiliation do they gain emotional clarity and self-awareness. This means love in Shakespearean comedy is rarely based on pure logic. Instead, it emerges through error, confusion, and psychological transformation. So, Shakespeare suggests that human beings often become wiser only after first becoming foolish. Now let us explore 3 highly sophisticated ideas that reveal the deeper philosophy of Shakespearean comedy. First, songs as philosophy. In Shakespeare's comedies, songs are not included merely for entertainment or decoration. They often summarize the central themes of the play and provide emotional or philosophical commentary on the action. In many ways, songs function almost like a chorus in classical drama, guiding the audience toward deeper interpretation. A very important example is Fester in Twelfth Night. His songs reflect ideas about love, time, foolishness, and human imperfection. An excellent exam line to remember is, music functions as thematic chorus. Next, softened justice. Shakespearean comedy includes courts, rulers, laws, and systems of authority. However, strict legal justice is usually softened by mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. A strong example is Measure for Measure, where the conflict between rigid law and human compassion becomes central. Shakespeare suggests that justice without mercy becomes inhuman. Finally, identity is fluid rather than fixed. In Shakespearean comedy, gender, class, and personality often appear flexible and changeable. Characters shift roles through disguise, performance, and altered social situations. Most importantly, disguise does not merely hide truth, it often reveals deeper truth. Characters discover their real emotions, desires, and identities only after adopting another role or appearance. So, Shakespearean comedy presents identity not as something permanent and fixed, but as dynamic, performative, and constantly evolving. Now let us conclude with some of the deepest and most sophisticated ideas in Shakespearean comedy. First, the idea of laughter as correction. Shakespearean comedy is not only meant to entertain, it also corrects human behavior socially. Characters who are arrogant, proud, foolish, or self-deceived are gently mocked through humor. Their weaknesses are exposed, not to destroy them, but to reform them. Comedy therefore becomes a social and moral instrument. Pride is ridiculed, foolishness is revealed, and characters gradually move towards self-awareness and balance. Next, the idea of symmetry in pairs. Shakespeare often structures comedy through balanced contrasts and doubles. We frequently see two couples, two worlds, or even two identities operating together within the same play. For example, the court and the forest, seriousness and wit, reality and disguise. This symmetrical structure creates harmony, balance, and dramatic richness. Comedy depends on these parallel patterns to achieve resolution. Now let us examine the comic hero. Unlike tragedy, Shakespearean comedy usually does not present a grand heroic figure. Comic protagonists are ordinary, flawed, and socially connected human beings. They are not elevated above society like tragic heroes. Instead, they are reintegrated back into society at the end. An excellent exam phrase is, comic protagonists are socially integrated, not elevated. Finally, the deepest philosophical idea behind Shakespearean comedy is adaptability. Comedy teaches that life is not perfect, but it is flexible and capable of renewal. Mistakes happen, confusion occurs, and human beings remain flawed. Yet society absorbs these errors and moves toward reconciliation rather than destruction. So, Shakespearean comedy ultimately celebrates human imperfection, social harmony, and the possibility of renewal through laughter, forgiveness, and understanding.